Do you want to know how to place a single implant? Then stay here. Welcome to the Camlog surgical tutorial. I'd like to show you now how to place a late single implant by incision lines, flap management, implant placement and suturing technique. So enjoy that video by seeing how I draw it, do it and explain it. First of all, I'd like to show you the incision lines. Look here, because if we have a submerged healing, I'd like to cut more to the palatal aspect. Then we cut paracrestally, palatally, then around the tooth a circular incision, again a circular incision around the premolar. So if you don't need to augment horizontally or vertically, you don't need in any case a vertical releasing incision. If you want to do one because of more sight, you may do a vertical releasing incision at the distal angle line of the second premolar. This incision line we do later on. Let's start with the incision line on the palatal aspect and the sulcular incision. This is the bone. This is the gingiva and mucosa. You have to know that around here we have the insertion of the mimic muscle. From here we have the beginning of keratinized tissue. Why do I show this such in detail? Because later on when we discuss split thickness approaches, you should know where the muscle is. Now let's draw the incision line. As I told you, from the palatal aspect, this is palatal, this is buccal side. From the palatal aspect, we go down to the bone. We stay beyond the periosteum, but we stay above mimic muscle. And now we reflect the flap. After reflecting, it looks like this. And now you have the opportunity to drill the hole for the implant. So we start with a palatal paracrestal injection down to the bone, into the sulcus. I do this twice because with the first incision you mostly don't touch the bone completely. If you go the second time, you can completely go down to the bone. Then the sulcular incision. Be careful not to damage the periodontium of the adjacent teeth. And after that, we raise the flap with a small respiratory. Before you raise the flap with the respiratory, be careful that you overcut the edges. I show you. Overcutting the edges means you cut here and you slightly overcut this cut. Why? Because if you have a sticky edge, you would wrap it. And wrapping your tissue means damaging the tissue. Now we take a forceps and a small respiratory. And by starting from one edge, we lift the flap very gently. And voila, you have your first mucoperiosteal flap. Let's have a look on the buccal side. This is the gingiva. The vertical releasing incision, you come from the palatal around the tooth in the sulcus. And here at the line angle, we go out and now we create an edge. This edge is important. Why? Because after reflecting the flap, you may easily resuture first this area, and after that you may suture the rest. So if you want to do a vertical incision, you should start at the distal angle line, and I do only distal vertical incisions. You see, in the rubber dam material or rubber material, it's very difficult. In the real tissue, it's much easier. Again, overcut the edges slightly and do it twice. You see, I overcut the edges and I also cut an edge in this area. Why? Because after reflecting the flap and the flap starts to swell, you can easily readapt the vertical releasing incision in the same position, because the first thing you readapt is the edge. So now we have the vertical incision on the distal side. Why don't I do a vertical incision around a canine? Because every vertical incision has a risk of scar tissue and, of course, of recession defects. And if you would have a vertical incision line here at the canine and you would end up with a recession defect, it would be visible. Now I'm lifting the mucoperiosteal flap from the palatal and also from the releasing incision line. You see how easy it is removable from the bone. If you want to have more sight and you don't want to touch the flap, you might use a holding suture. I'm stitching from the inside of the flap around the flap, and then we go down into the vestibular area. On the model, it's not as easy like in the mouse because we have only limited material here. So we go through the tissue, in and out, and back through the flap. And now we only place 2 knots. Now the flap is reflected to the buccal sides. You don't have to touch it and you have more sight. Let's start by marking the bone in the right position. For this we use a round drill. The next drill is the pilot drill. If you are not really firm in how the length marking is built on the drill, you should use the depth marking system. So you just put it on and now you have the right length and you can drill down to the contact. Especially in cases where you have narrow space in between the teeth, you might also use a drill extension. And this allows you to drill in narrow spaces without touching the head of your angle piece and the teeth. Next step is the form drill, and now we use a 13mm drill, and we start with the 3.3 diameter. The next step is the form drill with 3.8mm in diameter. If the bone is really hard, according to Misch, it would be D1. This is not in the upper jaw, but if it would be in the lower jaw, you might use this dense bone drill, which enlarges the drilling hole a little. Finally, we open the box with the implant. We take out the implant by not touching the surface, and we position it in the drilling hole. With a ratchet, you can determine the torque, and I use a torque control with 30 Newton centimeters. It is important to put only vertical forces to the implant. So for that reason, I put my finger on top of the ratchet. You see how nicely this implant system is primary stable. Now we already have 30 Newton centimeters torque control. Now I'm blocking the ratchet. This was only to have control and to know how is the insertion force. For a better prosthetic reconstruction, you should put one notch to the buccal side. Now I take off the insertion tool, and that's the implant in place. Next step is to close the implant with a cover screw. Therefore, I take out the cover screw by not touching it with my fingers. There is one possibility to keep the inner surface of your implant free of blood, because in the real case, you have now bleeding into the inner surface of the implant. For that reason, I suggest to put some chlorhexidine gel into the inner side of the implant so no blood can flow into. And if you now position your cover screw, the cover screw just pushes the gel into the implant and the excess pushes the blood outside. Implant placement done. Now, after removing the holding suture, we test if the flap is tension-free. Of course, we didn't do any augmentation. Your flap should be tension-free. The suture of the mucoperiosteal paracrestal part is done with a 5-0 suture. At the edges, we use single knot suture. In the middle of the paracrestal flap, you also may use a mattress suture. Because of on the buccal side, the flap in real anatomy seems to be not as thick as on the paracrestal palatal side. We use a thinner suture material on the buccal side. The advantage of the micro suturing technique allows you to suture very thin gingiva. For that reason, you see that the knot is not completely closed. Now let's move a little more in a realistic situation. And we use for that a pick jaw. So if you want to train the situation, just organize a pick jaw and you can do the same surgery there. We cut at the palatal or lingual aspect down to the bone. Minimum 2 times, just to be sure that you cut through the periosteum. Around the distal tooth to the line angle and around the mesial tooth. The vertical releasing incision is done on the line angle. Overcut the edges. Now we lift a mucoperiosteal flap. The next step is the holding suture. Now your assistant only has to lift the cheek, and by lifting the cheek, the flap also is moved to the lateral. Here you see the bone. We start again with a round drill. The pilot drill with 13 mm depth stop. The first form drill with 3.3 mm in diameter. The 3.8 mm form drill. And now the final 4.3 mm. We take out the implant by not touching the implant surface. Just reflect the cheek and you see the flap is also reflecting. Now you see how hard it is to come in. So for this reason we use a dense bone drill. Now I take out the implant and put it into the drilling hole. You see 30 Newton centimeter torque control. The implant is completely in the position we wanted to drill it. Next step is suturing. We remove the holding suture and we check the position of the flap. Without tension, we can suture now. In between those single knot sutures, I place a mattress suture. The vertical releasing incision is sutured with 6-0 nylon or polypropylene. We start at the edge. Three single knot sutures should be enough. Now the flap is closed. The healing should be uneventful. After 5 to 7 days, you can remove the stitches. I'd like to summarize. Think about flap design. Where to put the first cut. Overcut the edges. Place the implant according to prosthetic orientation. Finally, do the sutures with tension-free flap closure. I wish you good success for your implant.